All right, so I have the Hebrew word BЄriyth, which means covenant. So it's the good word that all Reformed people have been looking forward to. T-Dot lists a ton of possible original meanings for this word. No one's exactly sure the origin. It could range from something like to eat or to dine, referring to some kind of meal as part of the covenant seminary or ceremony. Words like between, among, clasp, to look for, to choose, or fetter. Fetter, the T-Dot said, is probably the most likely that most scholars go with. According to a search in the Calvin Seminary app, that revealed 284 occurrences of the word throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, pretty evenly spread through all of the books. So it's essential to Torah and to the prophets and to everyone. It's central to everyone's thought in the Old Testament. Mary Donovan Turner defines it as a formal agreement or treaty between two parties, with each party assuming some kind of commitment or obligation toward the other. And T-Dot as well said that essential to understanding covenant is law and obligation. So what I want to zero in and focus on is the running theme throughout Scripture of what do we do with those obligations? How do we expect God to fulfill those obligations? And what happens when humans who all too often break those obligations? Mary Donovan Turner in the Old Testament Word Book says, the prophets in the Old Testament saw the relationship between God and Israel as permanent, their covenant binding and everlasting. Even when the Israelites failed to live up to their God's expectations, God called them back. Psalm 89 is what I'm going to focus on. It's a beautiful hymn to God's faithfulness and contains 4 of the Psalm's 21 occurrences of BЄriyth. The psalm specifically focuses on God's covenant with David, delivered in 2 Samuel 7:16, which says, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Psalm 89 is about 50 verses long, so I won't read the whole thing. I'm going to focus on the 4 key passages that talk about BЄriyth. The first is in verse 28. I will always extend my loyal love to him, and my covenant with him is secure. Then verses 30 through 34. If his sons reject my law and disobey my regulations, if they break my rules and do not keep my commandments, I will punish their rebellion by beating them with a club, their sin by inflicting them with bruises. But I will not remove my loyal love from him, nor be unfaithful to my promise. I will not break my covenant or go back on what I promised. And I'll save the 4th one for last, because that one's a little different. In those 3 instances of BЄriyth, God affirms that he will not go back on his promise. He will remain faithful even when his people are unfaithful. What it means is that his faithfulness will ultimately triumph over the unfaithfulness of his people. They will be called back to the covenant as the prophets do throughout the Old Testament. The last occurrence of BЄriyth in Psalm 89 is in verse 39, and this one's a little unusual in that it's the only one that doesn't assume God is going to keep his end of the bargain throughout the psalm. You have repudiated your covenant with your servant. You have thrown his crown to the ground. The psalmist fears that God has turned from the covenant. As God's people bear the consequences of their unfaithfulness, the psalmist asks in verse 46, how long, O Lord, will this last? Will you remain hidden forever? Will your anger continue to burn like fire? And the psalm ends on that unresolved note. The psalmist isn't sure what God's going to do with his covenant. God's final answer to this question is seen in Jesus. He is the promised king who will sit on the throne forever, and in him the faithfulness of God deals with the unfaithfulness of his people once and for all. On the night he was betrayed, he took the cup and said, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Jesus went to the cross to uphold the covenant, to confirm it, to fulfill it, and be faithful to it. On the cross, he bore our unfaithfulness once and for all. 3 days later, he rose again as the final victor over sin, death, and all unfaithfulness. In his resurrection and ascension, he affirmed the truth of the words he spoke during his trial, and showed himself the promised everlasting king of God's covenant with David. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven.